Do you know why we can't all just get along better? Because those other people are crazy. Let's face it, we're tribal. Whether it's our political ideology versus theirs, our religion, our culture, our brains are wired to be us versus them. And that was fine back when different tribes rarely intersected. But now we live in an interconnected world. We have to find common ground. Joshua Greene is the director of the Moral Cognition Lab and a professor at Harvard University. He's written a book about how we make moral decisions and how we can get along better with them. The book is called Moral Tribes, and Joshua Greene joins me in the studio. Josh, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Is there an actual science behind our moral decision-making process?
Oh, absolutely. So this has become an important area of scientific research really for several decades, but it's accelerated in the last 10 years and has become not just a social science, but really a biological science as well.
In what way? What's happening to our brains when we're making these kind of decisions?
Well, I can give you a famous example that began as a philosophical problem that philosophers argued about for decades and then became a kind of fruit fly for scientific research.
Is this the trolley?
This is the trolley problem.
I hate the trolley.
You hate the trolley?
Because I don't like people getting pushed in front of trains. And
Well, so the trolley problem is a bit gruesome, but it has a useful function, which is to help us see in very stark detail how our moral brains work.
Okay.
So should I go ahead
Sure,
and
go
give
ahead.
the explanation? So the old dilemma goes like this. In one version, there's a trolley that's headed towards 5 people, and you can save those people's lives. They'll get run over if you don't do anything. You can save them by turning the trolley onto a side track where it will kill one person instead. And if you ask people, is it okay to divert the trolley away so that you save 5 lives at the cost of 1? Most people say yes. Different case. Trolley is headed towards 5 people, and this time you're on a footbridge over the tracks in between the oncoming trolley and the 5 people. And now the only way that you can save them is to push this big person who's standing next to you off of the footbridge. He'll land on the tracks and get squashed by the train, and he'll die, but the 5 people will live. And if you ask people about this case, most people say that it's not okay to trade 1 life to save 5.
so what's the difference? You're still killing the other guy.
Right. So in both cases, it's 1 life for 5. And I better say this or you'll get a lot of mail from your viewers. We're assuming that this will work. We're assuming that you cannot jump yourself because you're not big enough to stop it. And even if you make those assumptions, which I understand are somewhat unrealistic, most people say that it's not okay. So what's going on? Well, it turns out that there are 2 different systems in the brain that are competing in this kind of dilemma, at least the one like the footbridge case. So in both of these cases, there's a part of your brain, a system within your brain, that is saying, well, 5 lives for 1, that sounds like a pretty good deal, a cost-benefit analysis. But in the footbridge case, something about that action of pushing the guy off the footbridge with your bare hands and using him as a trolley stopper, that sets off an emotional response. And one of the brain regions that's responsible for integrating that emotional response into decisions is called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's a kind of a hub in the brain. This is right behind the middle of your forehead. It's a hub in your brain that integrates emotional signals into decisions. And if you look at people who have damage to this brain region, what you find is they're far more likely to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge. The idea is that most of us have an emotional response that makes us say, no, that's wrong. We also have the cost-benefit thinking. These people don't have that emotional response, at least not as much, but they still do the cost-benefit thinking. So they say, okay, 5 lives for 1. That makes sense, and they say yes.
And this is kind of your dual mode brain analogy, which is it's like a camera. So you have the point and click, which is automatic, and then you have the manual mode.
Right.
Why is that distinction important?
Thinking about the camera, right? Let's start with why does your camera have point and shoot settings? So you can put it in landscape mode or portrait mode and point and shoot. You've got the shot that you want.
You can do it quickly.
You can do it quickly. You also have your manual mode. What's nice about that design is that it allows you to have efficiency when you need efficiency and flexibility when you need flexibility. So if you're just doing something standard, like taking a picture of a mountain from far away in broad daylight, you don't need to figure this out yourself. The manufacturers have already programmed in. They've got an app for that, and you just hit the button and it works. But if you want to do something fancy, you're going to take some artsy photo with your own set of specifications and ideas, then you put it in manual mode and you can adjust everything yourself. The human brain has the same kind of design. Our automatic settings are our gut reactions, typically emotional responses that based on our experience, both the experience that we've inherited, so to speak, from our genetic ancestors and experience that we've gained from things we've learned from other people and from our personal experiences. All of those things shape our gut reactions. And our gut reactions are pretty good most of the time, but they're not very flexible.
So are you saying that in the case of when we're dealing with them
Right.
versus us, that we should be in manual mode and we should be thinking about things and not using our gut reactions?
To a large extent, yes. And let me sort of back up and explain why. So what is morality really? What I think, and a lot of other researchers do as well, is that morality is really about solving the problem of cooperation. It's about getting a bunch of separate me's to form an us. It's about putting the interests of others over the interests of oneself, right? And our gut reactions are very good at doing that. That this is what we evolved to do, and it does. And our brains do this primarily with feelings. So we have positive feelings that motivate us to be cooperative. I care about you and want to help you. We have negative feelings. I would feel guilty or ashamed if I didn't do this. We have negative feelings that we direct towards others. You will have my scorn and my contempt if you're not cooperative. And positive feelings, you'll have my gratitude if you do the right thing. And our capacity for feeling all of these things, there's pretty good evidence that this is part of our innate endowment. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't operate differently in different people in different cultures. So when it comes to the basic problem of me versus us or me versus you, my interests versus yours, our gut reactions do a pretty good job helping us do the good thing. Not perfect, but pretty good.
But when we have to deal with people we don't like.
Right. When it comes to other groups, people with where the whole group, two different groups have separate interests or separate values. Now the very same gut reactions that enable us to form a cooperative community within a tribe, so to speak, create dissonance between tribes. And if we just rely on our gut reactions to try to resolve those kinds of dilemmas, so my gut reaction tells me that absolutely one should be pro-choice about abortion, but someone else's says you should be pro-life. You hate Obamacare. I think it's a great idea. Israelis versus Palestinians, global warming.
The list goes on.
The list goes on and on. When it comes to those modern moral problems where we have different groups with different moral ideals and different interests, that's where our gut reactions get us in trouble. And what we need then is some kind of way to step back, some sort of manual mode response, some kind of deliberate reasoning process or moral system that can enable us to step back from our gut reactions and find some common ground at a more abstract level.
Yeah, but when you don't like the other group, you're not going to sit and do that. You're not going to even be thinking that way. It's those people are crazy. Those people are wrong. Yeah. I don't want to have anything to do with these people.
Well, I think that is our day-to-day experience. If you look over the course of history, however, a bit of moral reasoning can go a long way. So once upon a time, going all the way back to the 19th century, a lot of people just thought it was obvious that slavery was okay. And how did that change? Well, obviously it's a complicated historical process, but I think there's good reason to think that over and over again, people making the argument that this really isn't fair, this really doesn't make sense, can wear people down. And the analogy I like to make is with geology, essentially, that if you just pour some water on some rocks, you can stand there all day and you'll never see any progress. Those rocks are still there. But over very long periods of time, the wind and the rain can carve out the Grand Canyon.
Joshua Greene is in the studio with me. He's a professor at Harvard University. His book is called Moral Tribes, Emotion, Reason, and the Gap Between Us and Them. You're listening to The Mimi Geerges Show. We're on the web at mgshow.org. There's an interesting study that you described in your book about honor and why it's so important in the American South in particular.
Right.
Talk about that.
Yeah, so this is research done by Dov Cohen and Richard Nisbet. And an historian had argued that there was a cultural legacy that gave rise to the political, strongly held political beliefs by people in the American South. And the argument goes like this, that a lot of the people who settled, especially the highlands of the American South, came from the northern reaches of the British Isles, and they were herders. And if you have a herding economy, you really have to protect your wealth, because if somebody challenges you, if somebody threatens you, they can walk off with your sheep. Whereas if you make your living with cornfields, somebody can't walk off with your cornfields. So people who make their living guarding portable wealth really have to watch out for their honor. And any kind of threat could signal weakness and could bring on more challenges. And so they argued that the people who brought that mentality and brought that to the highlands of the American South and Appalachia more generally, they took that honor-based mentality that made economic sense at a time when that was the way you were making your living and you couldn't rely on the law to guard your wealth. But
they're not hurting now.
But cultures are quite persistent, right? And so an historian named David Hackett Fisher made the argument that this still persists in American politics. And he observed that the American South has basically supported every single war that has ever been on the table as a policy possibility.
They're disproportionately
from the beginning
represented in the U.S. military as well.
Exactly. And so so then they said, well, is this still going on? So they did a really intriguing set of experiments at the University of Michigan where they brought in students, some of whom came from the American South and some of whom came from the North. And they put them in a situation where their honor was going to be challenged. So in one version of this, they had them walk down this narrow hall, ostensibly to go do something else as part of the experiment. And they made it very narrow by lining up tables. And they had this big football player come charging at them and essentially challenge them to a game of chicken.
One of us is going to have to move out the way.
Exactly, right? And then afterwards, they measured the cortisol levels of these people. So they took a cheek swab and actually measured the level of this hormone that's associated with a stress response. And what they found was that men from the American South had this higher stress response in response to that challenge as compared to others. And they did a number of other measures. They told people a story about a guy at a party whose girlfriend was being hit on by this other guy and asked them to complete the story. And the ones from the South were more likely to complete the story in a way that ended with violence. Now, I should say, this maybe makes it sound like American Southerners are nasty and warlike. Their research also showed that they're more polite. So that is, if there isn't a challenge, they're more likely to yield. They were more likely to step out of the way of that of that football player if they hadn't been challenged first. So actually, the challenge, the way the experiment is described, the challenge happened before the game of chicken, and the game of chicken was a sort of second challenge. But the point remains that you have this culture of honor where there's a high premium put on being polite when no one has threatened you and being very aggressive under threat.
And how does knowing that play into this concept of us versus them? How does that help us get along better?
Well, so let's say we have a disagreement about whether we should invade Iraq, let's say, in response to the 9/11 attacks. Well, many more people in the South thought that we needed to have some kind of military response against Iraq or Afghanistan than other places. If you both sides might just look at this and say, of course it doesn't make sense to attack Iraq, or of course it does make sense. Those are our gut reactions. Well, if we understand the science behind where these reactions come from, if we can step back and say, why do I feel this way? And can I really trust this feeling? Then having enough distance on there, having a scientific understanding of our gut reactions can allow us to step back and question them. And it doesn't mean you necessarily change your mind, but at least it gives you the opportunity to respond to evidence that might make you change your mind, as opposed to just taking your gut reaction as
so this
as
is
the
Josh,
truth.
This is the concept of biased perception, right?
Yeah.
Which is we've all got the access to the exact same facts,
Right.
but we come to different conclusions.
Right. Right. So this is a classic example of this done by Lee Ross and colleagues. They had people following what's been termed the Beirut Massacre in the 80s watch news coverage of that event. And both sides reported that the news coverage that they saw was biased in favor of the other side, right? That that you can take the same set of facts, the same thing in front of you, and both groups, one sees it as pushing against and the other sees it as doing the opposite. And the hope is that by becoming aware of these biases, by recognizing that we're subject to them, we can be a little bit more reasonable and say, well, this is how I feel, but maybe I'm just like the people in that experiment.
You mentioned abortion before, so let's talk about that. I mean,
Right.
It's a pretty hard subject.
Right.
But I mean, can we decide which side is more moral, pro-choice or pro-life?
I think it's a very difficult problem, and I think that the way we talk about it is really counterproductive. So we all know the drill. It's the woman's right to choose versus the fetus's right to life. And we make these confident assertions. We say, a fetus has a right to life or a woman has a right to choose. But what's really behind that? It's actually very hard to make a coherent case for both of these rights as something like absolute right. So on the pro-choice side, we say a woman has a right to choose, but very few people would say that a woman has a right to choose at 9 months of pregnancy. So the question is really not, does a woman have a right to choose, but why does a woman's right to choose end somewhere in the middle of pregnancy as opposed to at the beginning of pregnancy, the way people who
And
are
at
pro-life
what point
say?
is it?
Right. And the prevailing standard right now following Roe v. Wade is viability outside the womb. When the fetus is viable outside the womb, that's where we draw the line. But that really is kind of a proxy for something else. First of all, viability outside the womb is as much a function of technology as what the moral status of the fetus itself. And not only that, there are cases in which we would clearly abandon that standard. So suppose you have a woman who's 9 months pregnant and the fetus is known to have some lung condition that at the moment would prevent it from breathing air outside the womb. But we also know that this condition will resolve in a few days and then the child will be born. So this fetus is not viable outside the womb right now, but will be born perfectly healthy. Few people would say because it's not viable right now that you can abort that fetus at 9 months. So it's not about viability per se, right? And then you say, well, what is it really about? And people point to things like, well, can the fetus feel pain? Does the fetus have some conscious awareness, some sense of itself, some kind of rudimentary relationship with mother or other people? Well, the problem with that argument is that those same features apply to animals that we eat, like pigs, or at least that we are pro-choice about, that we allow others to eat as a matter of personal choice. If you're going to say you can't kill something that can feel pain or something that might be conscious or have emotions, well, then you shouldn't allow anyone to have a pulled pork sandwich.
So really, we can't solve this abortion problem.
Well, I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's a lot harder than just pounding your fist on the table and saying, I believe in a woman's right to choose. And I think the problems are just as big on the pro-life side. So this is not just a criticism of the pro-choice position. We make these confident proclamations and we talk about rights, but really that's just a cover-up for our gut reactions. And if we really want to make progress, we have to stop relying on our gut reactions and look at the consequences of our policies.
Joshua Greene is in the studio with me. The book we're discussing is called Moral Tribes, Emotion, Reason, and the Gap Between Us and Them. Joshua Greene is a professor at Harvard University and the director of the Moral Cognition Lab. What is the Moral Cognition Lab? What do you do there?
So we do a lot of different things. Some of our research is pretty low tech. We'll have people respond to questions about, is this right? Is this wrong? Why? Sometimes we have people respond to questions with a little bit of a laboratory manipulation. So one example is we have people think about moral dilemmas, and at the same time, we have them do a visual memory task or a verbal memory task. And what we find is that doing a visual task but not a verbal task changes people's judgments. Why? Well, think about pushing the guy off the footbridge. A lot of people have you have your visual imagery, your movie in the mind. It turns out that if you disrupt people's visual imagery by making them do something visual at the same time, then it changes their judgments and they become, in this case, more willing to say that it's okay to push the guy off the footbridge because the emotionally evocative imagery is not as strong. So that's one example. We do brain imaging studies. So the work we're probably best known for is putting people in brain scanners and having them respond to moral dilemmas and try to understand what's going on in the brain when people think about these things. We've recently started doing work with genetics, looking at genetic factors that affect people's judgments. So we do a lot of things.
Now, how does religion play into all this? Because some people will just say, well, morality is about God and God's laws or God's will.
Right. So there are really two questions there is, as a descriptive matter of fact, what role does religion play? And then there's a normative moral question, what role ought religion to play? So talk about the first question first. So descriptively, a lot of people think, and I think this is right, that religion is essentially, at least began as a tribal cooperation device, right? That if you want to get a large group of people to cooperate together, people who don't necessarily know each other personally, what can you do? Well, if you have this common creed and a common set of rules that say you have to be good to these other people and you will go to heaven if you do and you'll go to hell if you don't, and so on and so forth, and you have a shared set of songs and traditions and things, that's a way of binding people together in a circle.
Creating a tribe.
Creating a tribe that's wider, that's bigger than just the tribe of the people that you know personally. And so you have this larger group of brothers and sisters. It's like a secret handshake that allows people to recognize each other and trust each other to cooperate. So religion is about solving that me versus us problem on a larger scale. But then when you have different religions, different tribes, then of course you
Then
have the
them
us
becomes a
versus
big
them
problem.
right? And so religion is great for coordinating behavior within tribe and making people good. And that's why for so many people, their religion is like the greatest thing in their life. It's what gives them meaning. It's what binds them to the people who are most important to them and makes them feel like they're part of something larger. But as we all know, religion can also be very divisive. And so this brings us to the second question. So when it comes to something like abortion, what role should religion play? Maybe this is a good opportunity to criticize the other side of the abortion debate, right? So when people are pro-life, they say, well, why not choose life? You're denying this person who could be their entire existence. Aren't you glad that your mother didn't abort you, that you were allowed to live? And that's a pretty
killing somebody.
pretty compelling argument. The problem with that argument, at least the way I just stated it, is that it also applies to birth control. It also applies to abstinence, right? Aren't you glad that your parents decided to have you in the first place?
But life hasn't started yet.
That's exactly right. So that's exactly what they'd say, that it's not about producing more life. It's not about cutting short a life that could be. It's about a life that's already underway in some sense. Well, so this comes to the question people always ask, when does life begin? And the pro-life answer is usually at fertilization. But it's not exactly right. A sperm and an egg are both alive, right? So what they're really saying is that some individual's life begins when the sperm and egg are united. Now, if you just have a separate sperm and egg, like in a fertility clinic swimming around in a petri dish, you can say, we know what genetic person is going to exist if anyone does, right? But you wouldn't say that if you backed out of the IVF procedure at that moment before the egg and sperm join, that you've killed somebody. So it's really, the question is what happens physically when they join, or metaphysically when they join. And I think that what the pro-life position really comes down to is the conviction that when the sperm hits the egg, a soul comes whooshing in from another realm. Now, maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but there's no scientific evidence, there's no observable evidence that that's true. And if pro-life people came out and said, I want abortion to be outlawed because I believe that souls come whooshing in at the moment of fertilization, that sounds a lot more speculative and shaky than saying, I believe in a fetus's right to life. Aren't you glad your mother didn't abort you, right? So both the pro-life position and the pro-choice position, they really, when you scratch beneath the surface, are based on a lot of iffy stuff. Now, the question we started with was, what role should religion play? The problem is that it's going to be very hard for a religious doctrine to settle issues between tribes in a multicultural society. You can say, well, my tribe teaches me this, and that life begins at conception, and so on and so forth. Well, okay, but can that really be the basis for law in a multicultural society? And I think that at least a lot of socially conservative religious moralists, they would be more honest to just say, this is my faith-based conviction, and I believe it so strongly, I'm willing to impose it on other people, even though I don't have any observable evidence for it. And if you were forced to be honest about it and put it that way, it would be a much harder sell.
So isn't the solution to getting along, Josh, just for all of us to stop being so self-righteous and recognize that we're all different, and other people might have some good ideas as well?
I think that's step one. But
not enough.
Not enough, because it still leaves you in this position. You say, okay, so I'm a reasonable pro-choice person, and I say, okay, I understand that these pro-life people, they're not crazy, and they have their beliefs, and they're moral people, they're not evil people. But now, should I say, okay, so I'm going to just kind of meet them halfway and say, well, let's add some additional abortion restrictions? Or if you're pro-life and you believe that you're killing a human soul, should you then say, well, but I'm going to let it go, right? I think we need a system, and this is where the sort of third part of the book comes in. We need some kind of common currency for reaching moral agreements. We need some kind of philosophy that we can all kind of buy into, not because it necessarily captures what we feel in our hearts, but as a kind of second moral language, recognizing that we're not going to agree about our ultimate metaphysical beliefs, but that we have to have some kind of system for navigating trade-offs when the values of different tribes compete.
Okay.
And I think the best idea along these lines that's ever been put forth comes from the philosophers Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Their philosophy has a terrible, awful name, and it's been wildly misunderstood over the last century or so. It's called utilitarianism. I think a better name for it is deep pragmatism. Why call it that? Well, because what they're really saying is, in the end, what matters, or at least the stuff that we can argue about constructively, is consequences, and specifically consequences for human well-being, for improving people's lives, making people happier, or reducing the amount of suffering. That's the common currency of human existence. No matter what tribe you belong to, you want to be happy. You don't want to suffer. You want your people to be happy and not suffer. And you think that if all else is equal, if you're a decent person, that it's good that other people, even people in other tribes, suffer less or have a more enjoyable existence. That doesn't mean that that's all of morality, but that is our true common currency. And so what they said is, in the modern world, when we have to navigate these difficult trade-offs, we should say that's our common currency. Everybody's happiness matters, and everybody's happiness counts the same. And if you want to make a case in the modern world for your moral position, you can believe whatever you want about souls and so on and so forth, but you have to make the case that your policy that you favor is going to be promoting the greater good, is going to improve the quality of human life in a general kind of way.
What do you want people to take away from this book? What's the most important thing?
I think in a gist, so one, don't trust your moral intuitions too much, especially when it comes to moral controversies. When it comes to being a decent person in everyday life, your gut reactions are pretty good. At least your selfish, not your selfish reactions, but your what you recognize as that voice of conscience. But when it comes to controversies where whole groups of people are divided, that's when your gut reactions are likely to be very unreliable and to be the source of the problem rather than the solution. And then the question is, what is the solution? And I think the answer is to step back and to first be aware of your biases. And here I think the science of human nature can really help. We've learned a lot about the kinds of biases we have. And when you learn about it, you can see them out there in other people and in yourself. And then finally, to use common currency. That is, you may believe what you believe, but in this modern multicultural context, we have to have a common currency of observable fact. And that's really what science broadly construed provides. I don't just mean molecules and quarks. I mean all of social science, the endeavor of trying to find evidence about what kind of healthcare system works, or what are the social consequences of making abortion illegal versus legal, and so on and so forth. And then a common currency of values. And I think that that's where deep pragmatism comes in and says, let's just focus on making the world as happy as possible, giving everybody's happiness equal weight.
Joshua Greene, he's a professor at Harvard University and the director of the Moral Cognition Lab there. The book is Moral Tribes, Emotion, Reason, and the Gap Between Us and Them. It's published by the Penguin Press. Josh, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me.